Namaste. Today we have a great celebrity among us, Professor Subhash, a celebrity among fans of Indic knowledge systems, and also on the science side for physics, for astronomy, for archaeoastronomical understanding in many respects. Now, Professor Subhash Kirk has become a celebrity all over the world. I'll give a small introduction to Professor Kirk before we start conversing about today's topic, Vedanta and science, whether there is a convergence or divergence in between the two. Professor Subhash Kirk is a Regents Professor at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, USA. His research is on artificial intelligence, quantum computing, history of science, and Vedic studies. Nearly 30 years ago, he made the surprising discovery that the ancient Indians knew that the sun and the moon are approximately 108 times their respective diameters from the earth. This knowledge coded into temple architecture in the 108 poses of the Indian classical dance and the 108 prayer beads of the Japamala. He was the editor for the Indian subcontinent area for the UNESCO project on archaeoastronomy sites around the world. His work has been showcased in the popular media, including Discovery, History Channels, PBS, Public TV in Europe, and in several documentaries on science and all. He is the author of 20 books that include his autobiography, The Circle of Memory. Professor Kirk, I feel it my privilege to be able to talk to you on this very interesting and intriguing topic of convergence and divergence between science and Vedanta. I've been brought up in an environment, I grew up hearing stalwarts from time to time, every time saying, oh, science has come close to Vedanta. My undergrad days, unified field theory was the buzz at that time. And there were, unified, already unified is God, already Vedanta. It is one Vedantic idea that has come. And Nani Palkiwala and other such intellectuals, they used to make statements like, science is coming closer to Vedanta. And those days I used to think, analogies cannot be similitudes. Equivalence cannot be equal. And now it seems that that closeness, coming closer, has become really closer. And there are now more and more books on this closeness between science and Vedanta. One big turning point seems to be the consciousness studies and entering of consciousness into Vedanta. So, what is your response to these new developments, new books coming up, new articles coming up, everyone jumping in dance that they have come close, they have become one and the same and all that. So what's your response?
Well, first of all, thank you very much to Indica Academy and to you, Nagrajji, for hosting this particular show. Now, the question of where Vedanta and the mainstream Western science stand. There are different ways of looking at it. One is to go back to Vedanta itself. For example, we can go back to Mundaka Upanishad, where science is divided into two kinds. One is Apara, which is mainstream standard science related to associations and structure, either of physical things or concepts. And the other is Para. And Para represents consciousness. Apara represents things, and these things can be of different kinds. And therefore, Vedanta is one where you have both these aspects, apara and para. Now, normal mainstream science, Western science, is about apara. And I think that even if you have a unified field theory, it will be an apara theory, and therefore it will not be able to complete this whole dual or complementary structure of apara and para, which are two sides of the same coin. So the deep intuition of Vedanta is that reality has two aspects, that of the object and the subject. The subject is about consciousness, object is about things, and you cannot separate one from the other. Now, of course, in Vedanta, you also have the idea that everything is contained in consciousness, or you have ideas such as I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman, this awareness itself is Brahman, or you have Prajnanam Brahma as in Aitareya Upanishad, or Aham Brahmasmi. And all of these things, or Tattvam Asi, which is what we started out with today, where whatever you can speak of in your consciousness represents different aspects that are accessible to the consciousness, and therefore it includes everything. Now, to the question whether science is coming close to Vedanta, the creator, or one of the two creators of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, who himself was a Vedantin, many books and articles, including his autobiography and in his famous book, What is Life, says it so clearly that the central idea of quantum mechanics he got from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, which, and he writes, if you look at his translation, he writes that the formula, the Atman is equal to Brahman, was the central idea which allowed him to cross the obstacle which existed at that time in explaining why the electrons going in orbit around the nucleus do not fall into the nucleus, because the nucleus is positive, the electrons are negative, right? And they would be attracted. And the whole argument was, and which is what took us ultimately to the full structure of quantum mechanics, that a quantum state is a superposition of different possibilities. And then when the mind interacts with it, when the observer interacts with it, one of those possibilities becomes actualized. So this is one of the two central ideas. One is superposition, the other is interaction of the observer makes accessible one of those possibilities. So now leading physicists, historians or interpreters of science, especially quantum mechanics, have on countless occasions, and not just Erwin Schrödinger, many others have argued that quantum mechanics is perfectly consistent with Vedanta. It's not a question of whether they are one, it's consistent. But of course, the scope of quantum mechanics is limited, because in quantum mechanics, what you're trying to do is study physical phenomena, and the observer, which is consciousness, is always outside of the physical phenomena. And in spite of all the efforts for the past 20-30 years, such as in theories like the many worlds interpretation and many other interpretation, no success has been achieved in modeling the observer also through the framework, the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics. Because you have the framework which can be viewed as apara, and then you have the observer outside the system who represents para, and these constitute a pair. So then where we stand right now is that while quantum mechanics itself is consistent with Vedanta, but Vedanta is much greater than just the scope of quantum mechanics, which is to focus on certain phenomena. Because once we go back to the entire Vedic structure, and Vedanta is only one of the 6 darshanas, and these are all complementary views. The darshanas are complementary. They're not opposed to each other, but you take them as being opposed in order to sharpen your logic, your tarka. You say, okay, let's challenge it from here and there. But in the actual unfolding of science back in India, you had people in Vaisheshika, for example, have a structure, because in Vaisheshika, you are then constructing models of physical reality, and you have the Atman and the Manas also as a part of the entire system. So where we stand right now is this. Modern physics, in fact, modern science is facing the hugest crisis, perhaps as big a crisis as existed in the 1920s. And let me just list these crises very quickly. First of all, in physics, in cosmology, you can explain only 0.5% of the cosmos. 67% is dark energy, 28% is dark matter, that is 95%, 4.5% is interstellar gases. So then what remains is 0.5%. And that's all modern physics can explain. It has no evidence at all for dark matter or dark energy, right? So this is physics. In computer science, you cannot explain why the circuitry of the brain, because the brain can also be viewed as a machine, creates consciousness, while the circuitry of the computer does not create consciousness. And the question is, will the circuitry of the computer, if not now, maybe 100 years from now, will be able to create consciousness? And my own answer, based on all the stuff that I've been doing, and there are many others, I'm not the only one. In fact, most people would agree that computers will never be conscious, because all that they do in the Sankhya representation of reality, you have the various the Mahabhutas, the Tanamatras, the Karmendriya, the Gyanendriyas, and then you have Ahankar, you have Chitta, which is like a memory bank, and then you have Buddhi. You cannot associate Ahankar with silicon, right? So you cannot create the whole complex, which is essential for awareness to be there. Then you have, of course, Prakriti and Purush, right? So you have that great crisis in computer science. Then you look at neuroscience. In neuroscience, in spite of all the research that's been done through functional MRI, you look at the brain, the subject is aware, is doing a cognitive task. You cannot localize the neural structure where consciousness resides. So consciousness does not reside in the physical brain structure. In fact, this is what the Upanishads say. The Upanishads say that Chaitanya is beyond the Mahabhutas, right? The Chaitanya does not, it's not a property. If it is a property, then it will be material. And then medicine, there is a huge crisis in medicine. In fact, your viewers might want to look it up themselves. Google the reproducibility crisis of medicine. In many different fields of medicine, allopathic medicine, 70 to 90% of the clinical research cannot be replicated. They publish it, there's a huge PR stuff, and people say a revolutionary new thing. FDA gets its approval, and then 2 or 3 years later, they cannot replicate the findings. So huge crisis, and then you have the placebo and the nocebo effects. The placebo effect is about 30 to 40% of the patients, if you give them sugar pills, or if you just tell them that you're going to get well, mind interacts with the body in mysterious ways that the patient, 35% of the time, in most of the illnesses, they'll get well by themselves. The placebo effect even works in surgery. The doctor makes a fake incision. He says, okay, I'm going to work on your knee, and makes a surgery, but does nothing, and then stitches it up, and the patients get as well as the ones who have actual surgery. So what all this brings us, that outside of quantum mechanics, which is consistent, but now in other fields, such as medicine, where if Vedanta were to be brought in, where if we had the wisdom to give a second look to Ayurveda, second look in the sense that it's been pushed to the side, Ayush, not properly funded hospitals, or Ayurvedic Vaidyas themselves in a very defensive mode, not looking at the research, with total Atmavishwas, which is what we need in order to do research. And also another point, modern mathematics has shown, this is logic theory, and you can check it out for yourself, that binary logic is not optimal. Ternary logic is optimal. Western medicine is based on binary logic. In fact, Western science is based on binary logic. There's a very famous statement by Wheeler, John Archibald Wheeler, who was the postdoctoral advisor to Richard Feynman. And the statement is it from bit, that physics is from binary representations, right? But binary is not optimal. Ternary is. Ayurveda is based on ternary logic. You have three doshas, right? You have three, you have triples, sattva, rajas, and tamas. You have three gunas. You have three doshas. Western medicine is based on binary. You're either good or you're not good. So what we need in order for this convergence, while this convergence is already there in quantum mechanics, for this convergence to become much more full, for the benefits of Vedanta, and by Vedanta, I not only mean Vedanta as its own, Shankar Vedanta, or if you look at Kashmir Shaivism, which is also Vedanta, but more its expansion into other human affairs, which is where you have to bring in the other darshanas like Vaisheshika and many others. So if you did that, then new opportunities will arise or new possibilities, and those possibilities are going to revolutionize not only science, but all of humanity. Because look at this crisis itself, the crisis associated with the pandemic. In the United States, fatalities per million are more than 1,000, more than 3,000. And in India, it's only 360. Now, of course, since there's a lot of racism in all of everything, in all world affairs, so there are some people in the West, they're saying all of Indian figures are wrong. India, there were 4 million people dead rather than only 360,000 people dead. Okay, you don't believe Indian figures, go to Nigeria. Fatalities per million in Nigeria, only 15. America is 3,000 because they're using common sense. They're using prophylactics. In other words, they're using other ways to deal with the symptoms. And so the Western medicine, in its arrogance, is missing out on the most obvious things. And I think the time has come, especially for Vedanta, because Vedanta is this comprehensive view of reality where the observer is a fundamental part of the entire complex, right? Because in the Western view of reality, you only have objects. So you cannot explain freedom. You cannot explain the subject. And that's what is also led to this other crisis in the West of despair, that life is meaningless. Just last year, 120,000 young Americans, prosperous, good-looking, good young children, they died of opioid overdose because of addictions. Why are Western people getting into addictions? Because they are being told relentlessly that there's nothing but the outer world. But that cannot bring happiness and comfort. There is also the inner world. And all human beings are the same. Western mind, Eastern mind, Indians, Westerners, we're all the same. In each prani, in each living being, sentient being is the same Purusha, right? So this wisdom that we have of the Vedas, which is Vedanta in its most comprehensive manner, not only should we embrace it ourselves, because after 1947, India has been separated by its education system from its own knowledge tradition. But now we must embrace it, and not only embrace it, but also give it and share it with the rest of the world.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really so comprehensive. You covered the crisis in so many contemporary basic science fields. Actually, these were not even social sciences. These were not even humanities. They were basic sciences and natural sciences. The crisis in them is really a news to many people. Probably, for example, things like Schrodinger being a Vedantin is not known to many, actually. These things have to come into light more often than not. The words from within the Vedanta system for the categories are Jiva, Jagat, Brahman, and Ishvara. these four categories. And there is, apart from this para classification, there is a Vidya Avidya classification also. Ishopanishad talks about Avidyaya Murtyantitva Vidyaya Amtamashmate. So this science of the Jagat comes under that Avidya part, and the science of Aditya Varnam Tamasah Parastat. Tamasah, you were mentioning the dark part of cosmos. So that is that Vidya that we are talking about. And I think it was during the uncertainty principle time, for the first time, there was a feeling of I'm hitting the wall. And I'm not counting myself while counting everyone else around me. And so the reason for why that uncertainty was arising, for the first time, observer was actually coming into light. And then it was only then that Jiva part, apart from just the Jagat part, was coming into discussion. And that unification into Brahman was also happening in many ways, actually. Most of the conservation principles, and then field unification at several levels. But consciousness, the Jiva side, was actually the observed was forcing the observer to count himself, count oneself through that stage, uncertainty principle and the Schrodinger time. But now the quantum mechanics has taken so many leaps. And what do you think is the stage which forced quantum mechanics to include consciousness in its purview?
Okay, so do you want me to?
What was the development in quantum mechanics that forced it to count consciousness into its calculations?
Okay, well, recently, this is something that I work on myself. What has happened in the last, after 1950s or so, when the many worlds interpretation was presented, which is, one of the two postulates, central postulates of quantum mechanics is, one is superposition, for which Schrodinger himself said the Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, was the triggering idea. The other is the idea of collapse of the wave function, for which there is a very interesting sutra in the Shiva Sutra, which is also a Vedantin system from Kashmir, which says Chittam Mantra. So the memory associated in your memory bank becomes the measurement, and that's what reduces the system. This is one way of interpreting this. Now, what effort, which has been quite substantial after the late 50s or 60s, 70s, has been to by talking of this collapse as being represented by many, many different universes all existing at the same time, where in something there is one result, in some other there is some other result, which is a totally extravagant way of dealing with this whole problem of collapse. And this whole many worlds interpretation has really not gone anywhere. But the effort has been really, well, how can we model the observer itself? Because if quantum mechanics apparatus, mathematical apparatus, is comprehensive, it's the deepest theory there is, it should also include the observer. So that's what a lot of effort has been put in. And at the same time, while this has been going on, you also have had corresponding research and efforts in fields such as neuroscience, right? To model the operations. You have quantum mechanical approaches to brain, including my friend who passed away a couple of years ago, the great Carl Pilgrim, who was a neuroscientist, and the holonomic model of the brain, etc. So people have been taking analogies from one field to the other to see if some progress could be made. But to go back to Vedanta, which is what is very useful for us to relate to all the time, this distinction between avidya and vidya, materiality and consciousness. That's one way you can look at it. Avidya is materiality, and there is this whole unfolding of avidya, and we are also a part of avidya. We have both avidya and vidya. We have both material and conscious, which is para, which is transcendent. Consciousness is not material, because if it was not transcendent, then it should be material. It should also have properties. And if it has properties, we should be able to measure them. But it's para, it's beyond any such measurements, because it's the experiencing self. And the analogy that's used, which I think is very instructive, is that just as you have in the outer world a single sun, the source of light, which can fall into a million different pots of water, and that disk can shine, with that light can come through. Likewise, you have a single consciousness which shines in the manas, in the minds, in the jivas. The jiva sees himself through the cognitions in the mind. So it shines in the minds of a million different sentient beings, right? And although there is only one, we see multiplicity because of the particular lens that we use to perceive it. Now, of course, in at least one set of texts, all this is stated as clearly as we can, where it's stated that Shiva is prakasha, is light, and Shakti is vimarsha, is the ground on which this light falls. And the Anu, the whole world is seen in triplicates, Trika. One is Shiva, Shakti, and Anu. And the individual, who's the mind? Mind is classical. Anu is where you count. In our mind, we count things, our memories, and so on. Anu is in between. And therefore, there are different ways of doing things, of living life, or sadhana, and there are different upayas in Shiva Sutras. It could be Shambho upaya, which is the upaya from consciousness down, or upaya from Shakti, or Anav upaya from Anu. And then it's so beautiful that it also lets us see what the debates or discussions have been within the Vedantic tradition between the Vaishnavites and the Shaivites. If you go to Bhagavad Gita, because of course Vedanta in Prasthantrayi, Bhagavad Gita is one of the main texts, and the Upanishads and the Brahma Sutras, Krishna says, what I am is Smriti, Jnana, and Apohanam. This is 15:15. From Smriti, from memories arises knowledge, and that knowledge is experienced at that peak experience, because normally we are Pashu. In Shaivism, you have Pashu, Pasha, and Pati. This is another Trika. Pati is Shiva, Pasha is our bondage to our habits, and Pashu is our animal self, which is where we are doing things by instinct, where we are a part of Jagat, right? Where we don't have any swatantrata. There's no swatantriya. So here, what we have correspondingly then is our bondage to our ecosystem. We are always corresponding to things within the larger ecosystem, responding to what happens to us, responding. So in many ways, there's no difference between us and other Pashus. So the whole idea in Vedanta ultimately is to get that freedom. And that freedom is where we are Shiva, Shivoham, right? Where we are Shiva ourselves. And that's what happens in creativity. For those who are scientists or artists or any creative endeavor, because creativity can occur in any endeavor, could be in business, could be in human relations, could be as a speaker, that creativity occurs when we let go of our ahankar, we are midstream, we are a part of the large river, unfolding of consciousness, and where we are Shiva, that's when Shiva speaks through us. This is very, very interesting. A debate that's been going on in Western academia. Are we free or not? Because if everything is by laws, then we are not free. Forget about uncertainty principle. Now, that's just a vague shadow region, right? But everything is by law. In the Vedas also, everything is by laws, rhythm. There's no freedom. Everything is by law. Jagat is by laws, right? Unfolding. But accepting, so this is a question that in the West, there's no answer. Books are being written that we are all zombies. We think we are free, but it's only an impression we get after an action is done. Now, this question was also been a part of the discussion amongst the sages in India. And the question was asked, how does Ishvara do anything to reality? If Ishvara is the real Lord, what freedom does he have? Because if there are rhythm, if there are laws unfolding, then Ishvara is absolutely powerless. So the answer, which is within the tradition, is that Ishvara controls the universe through drishti. This is called drishti srishti vada. Through drishti alone, through observation alone. And this is also the central idea of quantum mechanics, which my late friend, the great Malayali physicist George Sudarshan, with a student in the 1970s, wrote a paper called The Quantum Zeno Effect, where he argued that just by observation, the observer can control the quantum state. And by observation of a peculiar kind, a particular kind, not only can the state be frozen, which is what the original paper was, you can also steer it to whatever you want. And the whole idea then of Vedanta is this, that we change the world. We are instruments of Shiva. If we become like Shiva, if we don't live our lives like Pashu, if we are able to realize ourselves, then Shiva works through us. That's how, then we are walking devatas. Or that's how the world is transformed. So it's all absolutely hangs together. It's beautiful. It's perfectly consistent with the deepest intuitions of science. Not that science has been able to implement or embody all these intuitions in its program, but the time has come now for those who know Vedanta, and if Erwin Schrödinger and some of the great physicists, and some of them I know personally, if they are Vedantins and they are Westerners, while Indians are very terrified. A lot of Indians do Vedanta, but after they've retired from physics, right? I personally, I think Vedanta should guide us in whatever we do. Vedanta in action is yoga, right? Krishna speaks of karmas, yoga karmasu kaushalam, right? So if you are really deep in Vedanta, through yoga, you will be able to do whatever you're doing, whether you're a researcher, you're a businessman, you're an inventor, you're an artist, you'll be able to do it excellently. And that's what lived Vedanta would be.
Yeah, wonderful. That was actually, I see that the word free will itself was already being used by some of the quantum mechanics guys, and there were references to second law of thermodynamics also, from statistical mechanics route from quantum mechanics to second law of thermodynamics. And I keep thinking that yoga is all about going against second law of thermodynamics. Physics is the science of the dead. So if you want to be alive, a living person, a living entity goes against that second law. So it is all about more output from input. So where is the input going waste? So reducing the waste is yoga. So that's what the whole effort of yoga. Actually, Swami Vivekananda, in a very superficial way, probably uses the word sadhana is all about overcoming nature. So by nature, probably he meant physics. So overcome
Yeah.
physics. Newton's laws are all the laws of the dead. Inertia is the property of the dead. So you have to overcome nature through yoga. That's a wonderful message that you brought in. And this Brahman and Ishvara difference. You have the Brahman level where you are a standstill, constant base, but there is that Ishvara level where you are participating in running the show, running the business. Uh, does science have this distinction between a running the show entity like Ishvara and an entity, an all-encompassing Brahman-like entity, which is under the base of this running the show entity like Ishvara?
Well, science doesn't have anything for it. As you yourself said, science is about the dead. Physics is about death, unfolding where there is no freedom, right? And what Vedanta is about is freedom ultimately, for which there is no explanation in mainstream science. Even in neuroscience, when people look at the brain and neural structures, they are looking at it as a machine. In fact, a lot of neuroscientists are much more materialist or mechanism oriented in their explanations than physicists, because physicists are always aware, well, there is this whole problem that the observer is always outside of the framework, right? Even in classical mechanics, even in Newtonian physics, the observer is outside of the laws, right? The observer is watching what's going on. So this is a problem in Western science, and this is one of the crises of science. And let's not call it Western science, because what is modern science is in itself based quite a bit on Indian sciences, Indian tradition. In fact, your viewers would be glad to hear that in Vaisheshika Sutras, Kannada's Vaisheshika Sutras itself, 2 of the 3 laws of motion that Newton gave are already there. And one of them, the third one, almost verbatim. And this is 550 BCE. And you can, I translated the Vaisheshika Sutra 6 years ago, 2016, and it's easily available. It's called a book which I call Mind and Matter, or Matter and Mind, one of those books. And so in Vaisheshika Sutras, because we were discussing this whole question of how to bring in freedom, in Vaisheshika Sutras by Kannada, he speaks of course, the unfolding, the rhythm, etc., but there is also a room for the Atman. And I think that is what is missing. And you cannot just use it in a sloppy way, because then you can believe anything. You have to do it in as skeptical, as logical a manner as is possible. Because ultimately, the whole Vedic thing is about use of logic and reasoning. You have logic and reasoning, and where that freedom is where the Atman is. The freedom part, there's always a freedom part. That is where the Atman is. But the unfolding of Prakriti, if you will, is according to principles, which is what need to be investigated. And it's not just material Prakriti, even social systems or structures, such as language, which is based on social communication. As we know, one of the most amazing creations of the human mind took place 2,500 years ago, when Panini cast the entire Sanskrit language into 4,000 algebraic rules. Just imagine, 4,000 algebraic rules, like a program, 2,500 years ago, where Western scholars tell Indians, you didn't even have language. You didn't have, not language. You didn't even have scripts. You didn't have a writing. How come he did that? So there is a lot of misconceptions about their tradition. And the great Sri Lankan scholar whom I admire very much, Ananda Kumaraswamy, in one of his books, Hinduism and Buddhism, says that literally everything that's been written by Western scholars and their Indian followers about Hinduism is wrong. Contrary to what they write, and that what these Western scholars and then their Indian followers is what has been propagated in India in the last 75 years about what India is. And we have ended up by misinforming generations and generations of Indians. And so this is one of the challenges that we face right now. Not just Vedanta, but the larger context in which Vedanta is taught. Because Vedanta is all about equality. It's not about hierarchy, which is what we are told in school books. It's every human being, every sentient being has the same Purush within them. We're all equal. Every mind is potentially as good as any other mind. This is something that we should not forget.
Yeah, absolutely. Fine. Wonderful. The Purusha concept that we see earlier to Sankhya also, right in the Rig Veda mantras itself, is an organization of the mechanical world. What happened in the early classical physics was mechanization of the organic world. And the reverse of that, the organization of the mechanical world was happening in a Purusha view of things. And you have Vastu Purusha, you have that Purusha, this Purusha, wherever there is this ecosystemic idea of self-regulation, self-sustenance, that Otto was given the name Purusha there. And the cosmos itself was looked at as Purusha, cosmic Purusha. Please go on.
There's another way of looking at Purusha. Of course, is consciousness, at the cosmic level and at the individual level. Consciousness is Purusha, right? Chaitanyam Atma, for example. The Atman itself is Chaitanya, right? So Chaitanya is awareness. But how does this operate? I think that's what you're hinting at. How does it operate? It operates at many different levels. That's why you have statements such as Yata Pinde Tata Brahmande, as in the pinda, as in the cell, as within us, so in the entire cosmos. And one can relate to it from the very fact that the entire cosmos ultimately resides in our minds. There's nothing. How do we relate to the universe? In our minds, in this dark chamber of our brain. There is no light in the brain. That's where we see the entire cosmos. That's where I see you. That's where you see me, right? Through this connection. So as in the pind, as in the body, as in the brain, our brain, so in the entire cosmos. And why is it even possible for us to comprehend reality? But this is a question that has been asked by many physicists as well, including a very famous essay by Eugene Wigner. How is it possible to make sense of the world through mathematics? The title of the essay was The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics, right? So the reason is what is called the idea of Bandhu. There is a Bandhu, meaning binding, between the Akasha of our Chitta and the Bhautik Akasha, which is the physical cosmos, and Chidakasha, the cosmos of consciousness. And it's because of this binding that our mind is able to make sense, because those possibilities are already constituted into the very nature of reality. So there is this recursion. Three things happen. One is recursion, which I already mentioned, right? The small and the large, the Pinda and the Brahmanda. The other thing that happens, which is what makes it possible for us to know, is through this idea of yajna. And yajna is transformation. Our understanding is a process of transformation. And this transformation is like climbing a ladder. And we keep on ladder one step at a time. And ultimately, as we reach the top of the ladder, you are free like a bird who can soar in the sky, which is called Kaivalyam in the Yoga Sutras. That's where you are free. That's where you are one with Shiva. That's where you see it all, right? That's what various yogic practices allow you to do. So this whole idea of yajna, sacrifice, is to let go of your previous understanding, just as you have to let go of your classical physics understanding. And this is a very difficult process, as anybody who does physics knows it, to go from that material only, avidya only understanding of reality to something which is much more subtle, which is that quantum mechanics, or which is to go from in social systems, social structures, you go from physical domination, as let's say in present day Afghanistan, physical domination of women, of everybody else, which is avidya, to one where there is freedom. Not only do you as a person have freedom, but because all sentient beings are the same, you and I really are the same. We are all Shiva. So we also see freedom in everybody else. And this is also very important in constituting society, which is just and fair, where everybody else has the same potential and same aspiration to freedom and to Ananda, because freedom is Ananda, you could say, to Ananda as anybody else. So this is beautiful. I mean, this covers everything. This Vedanta then not only covers physics, which is limited, which is of interest only to specialists, right, in colleges and universities, but every human being in all aspects of life. And that's where science and Vedanta come together, because it will eventually help us even understand and relate to other species like animals, which is why within India, there was this whole value given to relationship with animals in the ashrams, of the rishis. They also had deer, and they had this and they had that. Or in my home, when I was growing up in Kashmir, before our mother served food to the family, firstly, a portion of the food was taken and given to animals, to the birds and to the street dogs. Yeah, absolutely. So there was this comprehensive view, and this comprehensive view, beautiful view, which everybody would love in any culture, which unfortunately for 75 years, we have made fun of in our school textbooks. We have given this false story that India changed because these people from outside came because they believed in equality and freedom, which is totally false. If there was equality and freedom, it was in India, and now the whole world is getting ready to understand all of this in its many different aspects.
Yeah. So amazing, Professor Kirk, the way you brought the political and sociological consequences of Vedanta, that egalitarian understanding and empathetic understanding of not only the other human beings, even the other creatures, all other living entities, how Vedanta basically is deep ecology and has environmentalist influence, ecosystemic ecological influence. Wonderful. And when you were talking about Chidakasha, I was remembering the word Chidambaram. Ambaram is actually Akasha.
Absolutely. And also, before we forget, the avidya and vidya, complementarity is so central to Vedic intuition. The asuras and the devas reside within each one of us. And this is avidya and vidya. The asuras carry avidya, the devas carry vidya. And there's got to be manthan. Sciences are also the manthan. The Amrit manthan must take place within each individual. And through that, anubhuti emerges, understanding and prajna emerges. And that's what education should be all about. How to give the tools to every human being to do that manthan within them, so that then they will be the walking devatas that I say each individual should be. Now, if you ask me, why is it that China and Japan have done so well in the last 40, 50 years? In every Chinese temple, even now, in the evening, they do a chanting of what is called Nilakantha Dharani. In Sanskrit, And you can Google it and you can YouTube it. In Nilakanta Dharani, and it's in Sanskrit, they don't know what they're saying because they are just speaking. In Nilakanta Dharani, the chanters, it's in the words of Avalokiteshvara, who is the Bodhisattva, the highest Bodhisattva, the most advanced Bodhisattva, where Avalokiteshvara is worshipping Shiva as Nilakanta. And he tells Shiva, you who swallowed the halahala poison to save mankind, you are the greatest epitome of compassion, of karuna. And it's because they are devoted to wisdom, because Shiva represents wisdom. Shiva represents consciousness. Shiva represents freedom. In fact, the most shrines to Saraswati are not in India, they are in Japan. In Japan, Saraswati is worshipped as Benzaiten, the name they call it. And she has Pipa, they have a Veena, they call it Pipa and so on. And there's so many shrines. So what India needs to do is to, again, be dedicated to wisdom and freedom and knowledge. And again, adore Saraswati as we must.
Yeah. Oh, what a message. What a wonderful message. Saraswati, we have lost. Actually, we are after Lakshmi now, mostly. And probably that is the reason Saraswati is lagging behind. And when I was saying Chidambara, I remembered the expression Chidambara Rahasyam also. People used to talk about Chidambara Rahasyam, and in my mother tongue, it is an idiom to say that something is highly mystic, highly secretive, so you can never understand it. That is Chidambara Rahasyam. But actually, CERN laboratory has Chidambaram's Lord Nataraja there.
Right.
The Rahasyam of Chit and Ambaram, once they understand, once the CERN understands, the CERN has come close to the real Rahasyam. Chidambara Rahasyam is understood by them. Chidakasha Rahasyam.
Absolutely. And in fact, we must adore Lakshmi also, but all the three goddesses, Lakshmi, Saraswati, and Durga, have to be adored at the same time. Because if we only worship Lakshmi and we don't invoke Durga and we don't invoke Saraswati, our understanding will not be complete. And besides, we'll not be able to protect whatever we have obtained through Lakshmi. So we need to do all of them. And that's comprehensiveness. That is what is required. And, maybe I didn't complete my thought about, about how Krishna speaks about Smriti, Jnana, and Apohanam. While in the Shaivite tradition, what is stated is Jnanam comes first, and then Smriti, and then Apohanam. That the basis is knowledge itself. It's just a different perspective. You can look at reality through two different lenses, and they are complementary. And that's why Vaishnavite and Shaivite views are complementary. And that's why you have the idea of Harihara. They're really one, and you can, depending upon whether you want to focus on Smriti first, then that takes you to the Vaishnavite view, as in the Bhagavad Gita, or you want to focus on Jnanam first, that it's Jnanam first, and that's what makes it possible for you to relate to Smriti, to relate to the details of reality, which is what Smriti is. These are the details. That's the multiplicity. Jnanam is the unity, while the Vaishnava tradition is from multiplicity, you finally find and reach up to the unity, right? As in the cosmic vision that we have in the Bhagavad Gita. So everything hangs together. There is no fight between one or the other. Everything is together. And in my view, it is what will allow for the current crises of science, and I listed some of them, to be overcome. And I think if we prepare our researchers and young people, and not just academic researchers. Everybody, ultimately, every human being is a researcher in life. We prepared them, gave them a thorough understanding, intuition related to Vedanta. They will be able to be world leaders. They would be able to lead in whatever they're doing, because that's what everybody is looking for, this wisdom.
Yeah. That's really, that's the peak of your wonderful message through the scientific understanding of Vedanta. In fact, actually, you are repeatedly bringing Shiva Sutras, and there is that book called Spandakarikas also. And there is this idea of Prathamika Spanda. And if a physicist, for example, knows that there is a whole book of vibration, and there is one primordial vibration, the fundamental vibration that is the cause of everything, and that Prathamika Spanda has got to do with the consciousness. It is the vibration at the consciousness level, and how it actually matches with the Maya, Bahusyam Prajayayuhu in Upanishads, and all that. Then for a scientist, it will be so amazing to see that already something very similar to science was happening here in terms of Shiva Sutras, or in terms of Spandakarikas, or even Vedanta, all this. And the way you are bringing them all together, I remember by the time of Shankara, Shankara was not in need of responding to Vaishnavism or Vishishtadvaita, because they came later. But later, post Madhva Shankara scholars, they were responding to the Madhva views and the Ramanuja views, and they started saying that we have absolutely no problem with them. We, for example, the Purusha Bahutva in Sankhya is actually, you have to, when you are doing science, you have to recognize the separate identity of each object that you are studying. So that is what Madhvacharya is doing. He is actually identifying that and combining all of them, identifying them to be parts of a big whole, is what Ramanuja is doing. We have absolutely no problem with it. But what we are talking about is the consciousness being the outer world. That final unification is what we are talking about. That does not mean that we don't recognize, we don't agree with the identification of multiplicity or multiples into one big cosmos or something.
Perfectly agree, because all of these are valid positions, depending upon the perspective chosen. We spoke about unity and multiplicity. Multiplicity is also true at one level. Yeah. So all of these are totally valid positions, because para is beyond words. But then when you tie it up in words, based on the perspective you choose, you can either get to the Madhva position or Ramanuja position, Vishishta Advaita or Dvaita or this or that. But they ultimately are all the same, and these are complementary positions. Complementary positions based on one's temperament. One likes one or the other, and the path of sadhana that one has chosen. And likewise, in sciences itself, in academic sciences, based on what subject you're doing. If you're doing ecology, you're doing everything together. While you're doing atomic physics, you are looking at multiplicity at a finer grain level. So all of those things are valid positions because they are complementary positions. And in fact, as I've done many times, even the 6 great darshanas can be viewed as complementary positions. The 6 walls of a room, if you are out in space, space is infinite. There are 6 walls. What you're standing on is Purva Mimamsa. One side is Nyaya, which is analysis of words. On the other side is Vaisheshika, which is analysis of matter. One side is Sankhya, which is counting of tattvas. Another side is Yoga, which is bringing the tattvas together. And the ceiling is Vedanta, where this whole room is held together. They are all complementary. So it doesn't mean that you are not going to do Nyaya. All of those are valid. But we still fight with each other in the darshanas in order to sharpen our reasoning. So it doesn't mean that you hate the other. As some people who are understanding is not deep, they say, hey, the Vedantins say that Vaisheshikas are stupid. This is foolish. This is totally foolish. This is not, these are all complementary, but you argue with each other to push each other to get a deeper intuition underlying words. You know, you have words, that's only surface structure. But what is the deep intuition? For that, you must do manan, right? You must do that manan, which brings you to a deeper level of consciousness.
On that note of a wonderful, broad, magnanimous message of not only unification of various darshanas, also the different schools of Vedanta, also a unification of all of them, putting all of them under the same framework. That was such a really amazing. Sir, thank you very much for this message. A physicist giving us this message is much more important for all the viewers. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Nagarajji. Thank you for hosting this. Really enjoyed it. Namaskar to everybody. Yeah. Best wishes. And Ashirwad to everybody. Yes.
Got it? The flyer?
Yeah, one moment. It is sharing the screen. Indica Moksha, as part of his third Global Festival of Oneness 2022, we are going to have the nature of moksha and its means by Satyan Chidambaranji on the 16th of May, Monday, 7 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. in the morning. Thank you very much. Namaste.